Blackman of the Nile and his family, Part 12. Now we approach the attempt at making Judeo-Christian history, theology, and mythology appear to have had very basic Nile African heritage ancestry that was void of the so-called Negro. The European and European American authors, Caucasian or Semites, writing in said vein, relate all the way back to the Hebrew Godhead Yahweh, Jehovah, Elohim, Adonai, etc. This we will certainly observe in the following materials your author have extracted from the published treatise by Hyksos Bey, Egyptian Chronology, which has been mentioned before. Mr. Bey's treatise adds most enlightening insight into the machinations of Western civilized versions of the concepts developed by the ancient Africans and Asians high cultures that predated the origin of the Greek. Western civilization by thousands of years developed various graphs and charts which he expected to validate his history and theological and mythological teachings in the so-called 5 books of Moses. He developed others for the so-called New Testament, but in doing so he tried to attribute them to the African European high priest Manetho, who did not indicate any knowledge whatsoever with respect to the Hebrew God Jehovah, and could never have written anything at all about Jesus Christ, the God of the Christians, as he died more than 279 years before the proclaimed birth of Jesus Christ. The following chronological scheme by Mr. Bey should make the reader understand the extent to which certain writers have gone in order to make religious mythology appear to be history. They have distorted and sometimes plagiarized the works of many who were anti-religious to appear religious, the reverse being also true. We must end this very short safari into the aspect of chronological numerology of the indigenous African mystery systems of the Osirica with the following pages 36, 37, and 38 of Mr. Bey's Egyptian Chronology, showing the same manner in which the Julian calendar got its origin from the Nile Valley and Great Lakes regions of the African Nile year calendar, and in the process how so much of Manetho's teachings and writings have been deliberately distorted by so many European and European Americans in their attempt to prove the validity of Judaism and Christianity over all other Nile Valley religious experiences, yet using the same Nile Valley mystery systems teachings of the Osirica that were developed by thick lips, broad nose, woolly hair, and burnt skin. Africans for support, and even said Africans' calendar calculations have been utilized to prove that Jehovah and Jesus Christ, equally the chosen people, are realities of an experience that started with the so-called Caucasians or Semites in North and East Africa, Al-Kubalan, in this particular case, Egypt. Let us examine Mr. Bey's presentation of his Judeo-Christian chronology genealogy, which is very typical to that by thousands of other theologians and religious historians, especially those who are bent upon making the entire world accept European-style Christianity, according to the King James Version of the Old and New Testament. The following is his major attempt at creating for Judaism and Christianity a Nile Valley high culture basis of origin, according to Mr. Bey's. It is to be noted that Bey's Judeo-Christian orientation totally influenced his writing and calculations. The Septuagint versions of the Old Testament upon which he relied made them no more authentic than the original writers, Yahweh's inspired scribes, did. Manetho's work did not validate Herebou's mythology or religious histogenealogy either. His incidental references to what may have happened to appear as Herebou mythology and biblical history were comparable only due to a remote chance or accident, but not by intent on his part, as evidenced by the 8 volumes he wrote on many subjects, including the works on Mary. However, Mr. Bey continued in an area of even greater responsibility when he connected Abraham, the patriarch of the Hebrew religion and high culture, with Adam, the first man of Moses, Genesis. He used the following chronological deduction. If the above deduction are true, then the Hebrew patriarch Abraham must have entered Mary, meaning Lord Egypt, sometime in the year 2185 BCE, which would have been during the 11th dynasty, or 509 years before the Hyksos, the so-called Semitic shepherd kings that invaded and conquered the Deltan region of Lower Tamari in the year 1675 BCE, which was during the end of the 14th dynasty. Here also, there is an assumption that Adam was created by Yahweh, the Hebrew God, at approximately 135 years ago. Thus, it is evident that the mythological and or allegorical story of the creation of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, as shown in the first book of Moses, took place long after many Nile Valley and Great Lakes African high cultures had already reached their zenith and passed away. Yet all of them had produced their own creation story, one of which can be observed in the book of the Coming Forth by Day, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and the Papyrus of Ani, and translated into English by Sir E.A. Wallace Bulge. Not only did the Hebrew's creation myth follow that of many African high cultures, it also followed the African creation and development of the first calendar ever made by man, the stellar chronological observatory chart. They also developed many other Nile Valley and Great Lakes Masonified calculated charts, some dated back to approximately 10,000 BCE, but the Sabellian Silk Terrace high cultures of the Nile Valley went back even further, to at least 250,000 BCE, which was more than 243,000 years before the creation of Adam by the Hebrew Godhead Yahweh. Nevertheless, Mr. Bates continued on from Adam and gave this. Mr. Bates topped all of his previous hypotheses by comparing the Hebrew patriarch's history genealogical charts to the astrological calculations of the indigenous Nile Valley African geophysical charts. They were taught while they were more common grounds between the so-called Semitics of Israel and the Semites of Egypt and Ta-Nehisi, equally being forgetful that the Semites of Egypt had thick lips, broad nose, woolly hair, and burnt skin, like those described by Herodotus and other ancients who visited and lived among the Egyptians and other indigenous Africans of the Nile Valley. Mr. Bay summarized the entire Hebrew history genealogy he tried to attach to the Africans of Tamari with the following comments. It should be observed that Mr. Bay failed to recognize the fact that Moses was not only a man learned in the wisdom of the Egyptians. Moses, in fact, this biblical character, did exist in reality other than in the Hebrew Holy Torah, was an indigenous African of Tamari, Egypt, of the same type of physical characteristics as any other African we know today that carries misnomers, Negro, Bantu, Africans, south of the Sahara, Pygmy, and even niggers. This, of course, was until European American Jewish and Christian ethnologists, anthropologists, paleontologists, and other self-appointed authorities on Africa and African peoples made him a white Semite of Indo-European Aryan Caucasian stock. In Moses' own words, however, his fiancée, Zipporah, daughter of the high priest of Medea, could not distinguish him from any other African of Egypt, Ethiopia, or Nubia. This was his own story he allegedly passed on to God's holy scribes, which they in turn allegedly wrote down in the 5 books of Moses, also known as the Holy Torah or Old Testament. All through the escapade of Mr. Bayes for tampering with the high priest Manetho's original works can be distinctly observed. He tried to give the impression that Manetho himself developed the above hypotheses on Judeo-Christian and Islamic mythology and allegory, when in truth he knew very well that they were only attempts by certain so-called Jewish, Christian, and Muslim Old Testament scholars, theologians, and writers like himself. Their main objective was to establish a new sense of credibility and validity to Hebrew genealogical mythology in the creation story of the book of Genesis, the first book of Moses. But in doing so, they have only established their own justification for certain European and European American so-called Semitic peoples' claim to the land presently occupied and controlled by non-African and non-Asian Israelites, Hebrews or Jews. Of course, many of the African American Israelites are being expelled from the same promised land today because of the blackness of their skin and the physical characteristics Herodotus used in describing their ancestors more than 2,422 years ago. The ancient Africans of Egypt had no records whatsoever and left none relating to the biblical stories about Adam and Eve in the garden, the great delusion of the flood, or the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt with Moses. Most of these stories are nothing more or less than historical glorification of one group of people's mythological experience over another's, most of which have expanded and blown totally out of perspective and normal rationalization, some of it being actual distortions of theirs and other people's history and religion. The other portion left from the whole can be attributed to no more than the wishful thinking of what God's chosen people hope human experiences would have had to begin from a Judeo-Christian, Jewish, Christian, or Muslim point of view. Of course, the beginning must have a white Semitic, Caucasian, Indo-European, Aryan male in control of everything inside of his creation, the world and everything in it. The Queen of Sheba, King Solomon of Israel episode in the Holy Torah is quite typical of the same type of magnification that is way out of proportion to the reality of the facts relating to a horrible personality of biblical history mythology. This indigenous African, Ethiopian, or black Queen Makeda reigned over an entire empire at the time of her alleged meeting with the indigenous Asian King Solomon. It was more than 75 to 100 times larger than the tiny kingdom of Israel, stretching all the way from Central East Africa to the Ganges River in India, Asia. Yet, the most beautiful and powerful African queen and empress, Makeda, or Queen of Aksum, Sheba, stated, the most beautiful woman in the world, is shown apologizing to a little kingdom monarch Solomon and the daughters of Israel because of her blackness of color in the Holy Bible. This type of biblical racism and religious bigotry still is not classified as much anywhere in Western society's educational system, religious or secular, for even black people, especially those who refer to themselves as Negro and or colored, continue echoing. The Queen of Sheba told Solomon of Israel, "I am black, but comely." What type of madness could have justified the richest, most beautiful, most powerful monarch in the entire known world dehumanizing herself in the presence of a powerless man and his tiny kingdom's women like that, other than in the mythological Judeo-Christian religious bigotry and the chosen people racism in the European and European American Semites' interpretation and translation of the historic incident which had no such experience. The madness of Western civilization, great white race, which has become synonymous with Judaism, Christianity, and philosophy. Another instance of the same type of religious bigotry and Semitic racism is shown in the so-called Proverbs of King Solomon. In it, we have already observed the same type of distortions and plagiarisms as we did in the above story about the African Queen of Ethiopia, Sheba or Aksum, East Africa or Akubalan. We have also noticed that the actual author was not King Solomon of the Kingdom of Israel, but instead an African of the Timerian Egyptian Empire, Amenhotep, who lived more than 200 to 300 years before Solomon. In order to refresh your memory at this point, the author refers that you go back to pages 102 through 103, chapter 3 of this volume, also to the bibliography that is specifically given for this point in which Judeo-Christian and Islamic mythology and theology. We have reached another crossroad In our safari in the history of the heritage of the black man and his family, high cultures he created and developed along the banks of the Nile valleys, Great Lakes, northern, eastern, western, southern, and central limits of ʻjoʊkənən, otherwise known as Mother Africa. Chronological comments on High Priest Manetho's classifications of the Ta-Nehisians, Meroans, Cushites, Ethiopians, Punts, Libyans, and other indigenous Africans and foreigners from Asia and Europe whom dominated the Egyptian dynastic periods date BCE. 3200 through 2780 BCE, the first and second dynasties, dynasties, because the pharaohs of these two dynasties were buried at Abydos near Thinis. Their residences were at Nakhen. A few were built elsewhere along the Nile. These dynasties were famous for their remarkable development of fine arts and for the production of precious jewelry and various metals. It was the first dynasty pharaoh king who attempted to regulate the waters of the Nile around the Fayum region. This attempt to change the course of the flow of the Nile for agricultural purposes was the obsession of many of Egypt's ancient monarchs that preceded and followed this one. 2780 through 2770 BCE, the third and fourth dynasties, Memphite period. Sometime between these two periods, the royal residence of the pharaohs was moved to Memphis. It was also within this era that the architectural lover, Pharaoh Dozier, whom Herodotus called Zoser or Zozier, had the first step pyramid built in Saqqara. The architect and builder of said structure was Imhotep, who was taken before his death, recognized and deified as the great god of medicine by the Africans and Europeans of his lifetime and after, because he vastly was superior as a physical physician than he was an architect. This was more than 1,500 years before the Europeans and European Americans, father of medicine, Hippocrates of Greece, was born. The time period of building of the first step pyramid proved that this was not only of those alleged built by Hebrew Jews, if in fact they did build any in Egypt, for they did not arrive in Egypt, Mary, Kemet, or Osiris until 1640 BCE, at the earliest, with the first Jew Hebrew patriarch Abraham and 7 others according to the first book of Moses. 2565 through 2420 BCE, the fifth dynasty, was marked by the predominance of the religion of Ra, the sun, as the great I Am. Beginning from this period and subsequent to the solitary of Pharaoh Menkaure of the fourth dynasty, all of the pharaohs named themselves son of Ra or son of the sun. They also built their pyramid temples at Abusir near Saqqara. The most peculiar of these temples was built by Pharaoh Nasser-Ra. It was the first temple known to be built with red granite latiform capitals, which in no way whatsoever resembled the pillars of previously built temples. It became the model for many more that followed its constructions. During this pharaoh reign, the planning and erection of the famous tomb by one of Tamari's most famous architects, Tai, was built at Saqqara. The completion of a treatise on philosophical maxims by Pharaoh Ptah-hotep was the building of the pyramid of Unas at Saqqara that contained the first of the world's most famous pyramid texts, were further accomplished of this period. A composition of prayers from the Book of the Coming Forth by Day, Egyptian Book of the Dead, that adorned the walls of one of the pharaohs' Unas pyramid was also completed. This was one of the indigenous Nile Valley's Africans of Egypt's most creative period in fine arts, architecture, literature, religion, philosophy, and other disciplines in the social and physical sciences. It marked one of the highest artistic periods in the history of mankind all over the planet Earth, all of which was completed before the first foreigner from Asia and Europe arrived in ʻjoʊkənən, Egypt in particular, other than as a visitor or student of the learning of the Egyptian mystery systems that were centered at this period in Ta-Nehisi, Nubia, or Zeti. 2270 through 2100 BCE. The 7th to 10th dynasties started with varied political disorders, which were largely due to the incoming Asian foreigners that followed the reign of Pharaoh Pepi II. It was also during the period of the transfer of power to the hands of Egypt's functionaries of the courts, followed by their abandonment of the official royal residence at Memphis to establish themselves in southern Egypt, half of the nation as minor feudal kings, lords, from whence they became regional kings and lords, but of equally minor importance in the affairs of the government of Egypt, which was still centered at Memphis. They were centered and assembled at one court, which was more powerful than that of Memphis, however. Its residence was at Heracleopolis, the African Amasis. The court very soon after asserted itself as the rival of the counterpart center at the court of Memphis. The 11th through 14th dynasties, the Middle Kingdom. The beginning of the Middle Kingdom period was marked by a series of family wars between the minor kings of Anasis and those of Hermonthis. However, it was Pharaoh Mentuhotep's dynasty which became authoritatively powerful, along with the supremacy of Luxor in Thebes. From this point on, the reunification of Egypt came under the scepter of a unique and most highly monarch, the most glorious son of the sun, Pharaoh Amenhotep I, the so-called Negroid Pharaoh according to Western modern man. Pharaoh Amenhotep I, upon taking command of his throne, immediately established the worship of Amen as the official religion of the African peoples of Egypt. But Amenhotep was unable to subdue all of the opposing nobles by force because they had grown very strong in the localities they were allowed to govern by previous pharaohs before his reign. Yet he did win many others over his side by promising them glory and power under his rule. The others he could not convince through military power or peaceful means remained forever afraid of him. Amenhotep erected many temples in the main region of the Delta, Memphis, Fayum, and in Ta-Nehisi. He also established his royal residence at Itetu. In order to secure his power, Itetu was made a fortified city. For a very long time, it was considered impregnable. This belief did much save it from the enemies attacking it on various occasions. The very mention of his name brought awe to his followers and utter fear to his enemies. The reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep III, whose likeness is shown on page 199 of this volume, completed in the line of the grand pharaoh kings of the 12th dynasty, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, and one of the very few queens pharaohs monarchs who actually ruled Egypt, Queen Skemiophorus, preceded members of the Sebek Hotep's family, the so-called dwarf kings, but all of them failed to maintain the very high standards and strength and character set by their illustrious predecessors, pharaohs Amenhotep I and II. The lack of governmental skills and military know-how caused their successors to fall in the military clutches of the invading Hyksos Asians from the banks of the Hyksos River. These Asians, the so-called Semitic peoples, were the first of the non-indigenous African peoples to invade, conquer, and rule over Tamari. This took place between the years 1676 and 1675 BCE. Until this era, only indigenous Africans, the so-called Negroes, Bantus, Africans, south of the Sahara, Pygmies, Bushmen, Hottentots, Black Africans, darkest colors, forest Negroes, and even niggers, ruled Tamari, Egypt, Upper and Lower. This fact brings back memory to the 13th dynasty pharaoh Nisira, who was called the blackest of the pharaohs by white liberal and orthodox Africanists. This pharaoh mounted the throne of Tamari when it was divided for the third time in its long and glorious history, and has reunited divided kingdoms of the north and south. This is not to say that other peoples did not come to Tamari and other nations along the Nile valleys from Asia and Europe to live, work, learn, and even visit as tourists, just as other Africans of Akubalan throughout the continent, irrespectively of the so-called barriers. European and European American educators declared stop the commercial and social intercourse between northern and southern Africans. But it is the very first time that non-indigenous people of the continent of Akubalan were able to seize control of any part of this continent, which the ancient Greeks and Romans renamed Africa, and a host of other nomenclatures. 1676 through 1580 BCE, the 15th and the 16th dynasties, the Hyksos or Shepherd Kings period, sometimes between 1676 through 1675 BCE, a rampaging army of nomadic people under the command of their leader, General Saltus from Middle Asia, invaded and conquered the Nile Delta of Timeri, and doing so overcame its indigenous African peoples. These invaders were given this name Hyksos Semites or Chief of Budunia by certain European academics or scholars. They were the same people the indigenous Africans of Timeri called people of the ignoble birth. As recorded in the works of the African European high priest who wrote the Chronology of Egypt, these commentaries relate to their invasions was partly due to the effects of an enforced mass migration of Europeans fleeing east into Assyria, modern Syria, and Babylon to escape persecution from their fellow Europeans, along with Asians who were at the same time invaders of Europe. The vast majority of these destitute nomadic Asian peoples who amalgamated with the fleeing nomadic Europeans resulted in the southern push by Asians of the Oxus River to protect their homeland from fleeing bands. Thus the people called Hyksos or Shepherd Kings of Budunia continued their thrust until they overran the delta region of Timeri. But in a very short time in the delta, the Hyksos became extremely powerful as they joined in with other Asians and Europeans who were living as guests of the indigenous Africans to overthrow the existing government. The successful overthrow of the indigenous Africans gave control of Lower Timeri from Libya to the easternmost limits of the Sinai Peninsula. They also settled in parts of Middle Egyptian interior and ruled supreme over the areas they occupied in great numbers. But the Hyksos also destroyed the vast amounts of the temples and other monuments they met when they arrived in Timeri. They subsequently forced the Egyptian captives into slavery. Then they established their own capital at Avaris in the delta. They nevertheless had already destroyed practically everything they touched in Timeri. Why was this so? Because they did not understand the indigenous Africans of Timeri's high culture civilization they had invaded and captured. This meant that they had to constantly be watchful and did not relate sufficiently to assimilate with or contribute to the culture of the vanquished indigenous Africans. 1600 through 1555 BCE, the 17th dynasty. This period marked the beginning of the indigenous Africans of Timeri's struggle for independence from the Asian Hyksos enslavement. Three Luxon pharaohs, Sequin En Ra I, II, and III, directed the drive for independence against the Asian foreigners. Pharaoh Sequin En Ra III died in one of these liberation battles with his weapons still clutched in his hands. The last of his three sons, Pharaoh Ahmose I, 1580 BCE, succeeded him in driving the Hyksos from Timeri. Pharaoh Ahmose I followed the Hyksos in hot pursuit as far as the city Sharuhin in southern Palestine, part of modern-day state called Israel. This famous victory by the indigenous African people of Timeri over the mixed Asian European invaders and colonists is recorded on the equally famous inscription of El Kab, 1555 through 1090 BCE. The 17th through the 19th dynasties, the New Kingdom, Pharaoh Nefertiti Ashmes founded the mighty 17th dynasty, which ruled over Timeri for more than 200 years. He occupied himself with the expansion of the Hyksos, but in the meantime, the Ta-Nehisians, Nubians, other indigenous Africans were taking advantage of this preoccupation up north, and as a result, the Ta-Nehisians were able to reconquer all of Timeri's territories north of the Second Cataract, which they had originally surrendered to the Timerians in the Second and Sixth dynasties. Ashmi's rule in Timeri extended for a little more than 22 years until his death. He was buried in Luxor, which the present rulers, Arabs and Africanized Arabs, renamed Dara Abu Naga. His mummy is still in its originally preserved state in the Egyptian Museum, Cairo, now which is called the United Arab Republic. Ashmes was followed on the throne by his son Amenhotep I.